Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. I'm going to talk about the novels of Stephen Fry. Yes, that's Stephen Fry. You might not know that he wrote novels. You might know that he's done some retellings of Greek myths recently, but novels? Between 1991 and the year 2000, Stephen Fry wrote 4 novels: The Liar, The Hippopotamus, Making History, and The Stars Tennis Balls, or Revenge in the United States. Writing 4 novels in just under 10 years might suggest that somebody as erudite and well-liked as Stephen Fry is would be capable of writing more novels, many more novels, dozens of them. But 4 is all we get, and nothing for over 25 years. Perhaps there is a reason for that. Now, Stephen Fry's early novels have a large amount of autobiographical detail in them, so it is probably best to tell his life story through his 3 volumes of biography or memoir. These are Moab Is My Washpot, published in 1997, the Fry Chronicles, published in 2010, and More Fool Me from 2014. It should be noted that these memoirs only take us up to 1994, and he hasn't shown any plans to write any more. Stephen Fry's first set of memoirs, Moab Is My Washpot, take us from his birth in 1957 up to the age of 20. He's a middle child of 3. He has an older brother and a younger sister. And in Moab Is My Washpot, which is a very confessional memoir, he talks about the way that he never felt right. He always felt as if he was putting a mask on, only behaving in certain ways because that is what is expected of him. And never really feeling that that was the real him. Well, he always felt that he was pretending to be somebody else. From 1965 to 1972, Stephen Fry attended Uppingham School, which is a private boarding school. Stephen Fry tells us that he wasn't exactly happy at Uppingham. He did okay academically, although 1 or 2 subjects eluded him. He was not particularly a sports person, although some sports like cricket still fascinate him to this day. We're told of an encounter that he had with a prefect quite early in his time at school, and not entirely sure if that encounter was consensual. He also writes about falling in love with another boy at school and finding this love rather desperate. They have a few encounters while they're at school, but nothing really comes of it. And but it does seem to be something that affected Stephen Fry quite profoundly. He was eventually expelled from Uppingham School for various misdemeanours. I think involved taking unauthorised time off in London to basically watch movies for a weekend. Having been expelled from Uppingham, he attended other schools and was expelled from those in turn. He finally ended up at the Norwich School for the Arts. And there in 1974, when he was 17, he walked away from his A-level exams and essentially ran away from home. He picked up a coat belonging to a family friend, and in that coat he found a credit card, and he attempted to live off that credit card for the next few weeks. He was eventually arrested. He spent 3 months on remand at HM Prison Pucklechurch before going to trial, and I believe getting off with a fine, restitution and time served on remand. After this blip, he buckled down. He retook his A-levels. He took Cambridge Entrance, which is an additional set of exams you take after your A-levels. He passed those with flying colours and was awarded a scholarship to Queen's College, Cambridge. The memoir ends with Stephen Fry at the age of 19 ringing on the doorbell at the offices of Gabbitas Thring, a scholastic employment agency. He was aiming to get a job at a private prep school as a teacher or teaching assistant while he waited to go into Cambridge. Kind of a gap year thing. The next volume of Stephen Fry's memoirs, the Fry Chronicles, published in 2010, takes us from 1977 to about 1986. 1977 is when he went to Cambridge, where he did reasonably well academically, but very well sort of artistically. He did a lot of acting and was a prominent player in the Footlights reviews. The Cambridge Footlights Review has a reputation for producing sort of generation after generation of the leading lights of comedy. Not necessarily stand-up comedy, but more sketch and light entertainment comedy. At Cambridge, Stephen Fry met up with Emma Thompson, who has been a frequent collaborator, and also with Hugh Laurie, with whom he developed a very strong collaborative working partnership. Emma Thompson, Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry formed the nucleus of the Cambridge Footlights Review in 1981, along with Tony Slattery, Paul Shearer and Penny Dwyer. Their show was called The Sellotapes, and great things were hoped of it as it headed off to the Edinburgh Fringe in August 1981. Shortly before the Edinburgh Festival Fringe opened in about May, the mineral water company Perrier had decided that they wanted to sponsor something. Sponsor a bit of comedy, but not the rather low stand-up comedy. Maybe a review show, you know, jokes, sketches, songs old and new, with us around you won't feel blue, that kind of thing. So they set up an award, the Perrier Comedy Award, and Cambridge Footlights won it easily. They were undoubtedly the best review, and other than offerings from other universities, they might have been one of the only sort of true review shows. This has led to a suggestion from some uncharitable people that the Perrier Award was simply invented in order to give it to that year's Cambridge Footlights Review. It's not true, but it was a bit of a coincidence. Hugh Laurie, Stephen Fry and Emma Thompson teamed up again in various attempts at sketch shows before they settled down in a series called Alfresco. Alfresco added in a writer-actor, Ben Elton, and two actors, Siobhan Redmond and Robbie Coltrane, who was later both Cracker and Hagrid in the Harry Potter movies. It happens that Stephen Fry rather lucked himself in with his agent at this time. His agent was, very willing to give Stephen Fry some chances. He got him a rather lucrative beer commercial for Whitbread Best Beer, where he played the rather fascinating character Ivan Skavinsky-Skavar, and also gave him a rather interesting opportunity. In 1984, there were plans afoot to revive Noel Gay's musical Me and My Girl. This is a musical from the 1930s, and that meant it would need its book rewritten, the book being the drama bits between the songs. It so happened that the person who controlled the Noel Gay estate was Stephen Fry's agent. And Stephen Fry's agent felt that Stephen Fry might be a rather good choice to write the book for Me and My Girl. And so he did. And the subsequent production, which starred Emma Thompson and Robert Lindsay initially in the main two roles, ran in the West End for almost a decade. It also ran on Broadway for 2 years, and Robert Lindsay won a Tony for his performance. Stephen Fry's agent got Stephen Fry a very good deal for writing the book to Me and My Girl, and Stephen Fry describes cheques just falling through his letterbox week after week. He was, by the time he was 30, a millionaire. In the mid-80s, we see Stephen Fry appearing in things like Blackadder 2 in 1985, and also Saturday Live, which was a sort of sketch and comedy show that Channel 4 showed live on Saturdays. The memoir for the Fry Chronicles ends on a slightly ominous note. He has returned home with an actor friend, and his actor friend chops out a line of cocaine and says, "Hey Stephen, why don't you try this?" 4 years after the Fry Chronicles comes out, Stephen Fry gives us More Fool Me. He starts the memoir by making a kind of mock apology for the Fry Chronicles, making the point that all the critics thought it was a bit too self-congratulatory, a bit too successful, and none of the darkness or open heart surgery that there was in the Moab Is My Washpot. He then goes on to reiterate and clarify some of the stories that were initially in Moab Is My Washpot, talking specifically about his addictions to 3 C's, that would be candy or sweets, cigarettes and cocaine. He also gives us a little bit more detail about the boy he fell in love with and what happened after that was revealed in Moab Is My Washpot. But the main initial focus of the book is about Stephen Fry's relationship with cocaine. He seems to have emulated his hero Sherlock Holmes and basically only taking cocaine at times of leisure, never when he was actually working. Stephen Fry is actually rather firm about this, and it's making sure that you are not under the impression that any of the sort of works that he did, such as Fry and Laurie or Jeeves and Wooster, were under the influence, and certainly none of the novels were published under the influence. Stephen Fry was on cocaine for about 14 years, so up until about 2000. It doesn't seem to have affected him too adversely. In fact, he seems to have a little bit too much fun with it. Obviously, there are sort of physiological problems, bad breath, problems with the bowels, and other common ailments connected with cocaine use. But he does seem to have had a bit too much fun with it. This is pointed out by the critics of these memoirs, that he's not exactly saying, Stephen Fry, my cocaine hell, which, you know, I think they would have preferred than Stephen Fry, I once took cocaine in the House of Lords and Buckingham Palace. Yeah, it doesn't quite, feel like the confessional. Feel like the confessional that, of course, Moab Is My Washpot was. The last third of More Fool Me is a reprint of Stephen Fry's diaries for the latter half of 1993, going into 1994. It's very interesting. He is at the time writing his second novel, The Hippopotamus, and he has retired to a health spa in which to do it. And we get some very interesting insights into things. We do get quite a lot of entries where Stephen Fry is hanging out with John Cleese's second or maybe third wife. This is the marriage which, when it had eventually ended in divorce, John Cleese announced it rather like a marriage or birth announcement, and said, yes, we are getting a divorce, the lawyers are very happy. But all in all, this is a rather disappointing piece of memoir. It is certainly no Moab Is My Washpot. It doesn't bite anything like as hard as that. And while not as seemingly self-congratulatory as the Fry Chronicles, it just doesn't quite do it. It is not enough of a correction to the sort of the more dour and the more heartfelt things that we might want to expect from Stephen Fry. But of course, expecting that kind of thing says more about us than about him. In the mid-90s, Stephen Fry did talk about his bipolar disorder and his struggles with depression. And there are certain events later in the 90s and into the 2000s, even the 2010s, which indicate just how bad his depressive episodes could be. But I think I find most difficult about More For Me is the feeling that he has given up on being a memoirist. His first set was very successful. His second set, yes, people didn't quite like. And the third set tried to correct, but it just, in the end, didn't work. And the diary entries seem to be an aspect of giving up. In theory, there's plenty more that Stephen Fry could tell us about his life. But I think he's kind of given up on that. The nearest we've got to any kind of memoir from Stephen Fry since then is Fry's Ties, which was published in 2022 and is about Stephen Fry's extensive tie collection. Only Stephen Fry could get a book published about his tie collection. Before we finally get onto the novels, it is worth mentioning another of Stephen Fry's books, which is Paperweight. This was published in 1992. It is a collection of his newspaper columns and comedy pieces that he used to do for a radio program called Loose Ends. In a number of these pieces for Loose Ends, Stephen Fry created a character called Donald Trefusis. Donald Trefusis is a professor of philology at a invented college in Cambridge. We first meet Donald Trefusis when he's been asked to opine on the violence in television and films. Of course, being a philologist, Professor Trefusis decides to talk about the violence being done to the English language. He rather enjoys watching people getting their faces smashed in, though. So let's finally get on to the novel, shall we? The Liar from 1991. This is probably the most autobiographical of Stephen Fry's novels. When people read Moab Is My Washpot, they noticed an awful lot of scenes in that book that had been fictionalised for use in The Liar. The book tells the story of Adrian Healy, a kind of Stephen Fry avatar or surrogate, and the book is mostly divided between Adrian Healy's time at a private school, much like Uppingham, and some years later when Adrian Healy is at Cambridge, where he encounters Donald Trefusis. We also have quite a lot of stories about Donald Trefusis, who seems to be rather interested in young men from behind the Iron Curtain. This book is really set around the time that Stephen Fry went to university, so between about 1977 and 1981. As I said, Adrian Healy enacts a much more exciting, vicious and event-filled version of Stephen Fry's life at Uppingham. There is a particular event involving a rather scurrilous newspaper that is printed, and also there is a remake of the time that Stephen Fry absconded with a credit card. This one has far more serious implications, as Adrian Healy ends up on the meat rack outside Piccadilly Station. Whilst at this private school, which definitely isn't Uppingham, Adrian Healy falls in love with a young boy, and unlike real life, this attraction may well be reciprocated in some way. One of the first encounters between Adrian Healy and Professor Trefusis is when Adrian Healy tries to pass off an old and complex philology essay as his own. Donald Trefusis, of course, sees right through it, but offers a deal. All that Adrian Healy has to do is something extraordinary, and Professor Trefusis will pass him for the rest of the year, or even the rest of his time at Cambridge. And in a way, this results in the discovery of a lost Charles Dickens manuscript, which may deal with child prostitution. I think that most critics reckon The Liar to be Stephen Fry's best novel. It was certainly something that made a splash and showed an awful lot of promise. And people always knew that Stephen Fry was a rather brilliant young man, and this did seem to annoyingly confirm it to everybody. In many ways, it was a very mature and well thought out book. It had certain passages which were a little bit experimental, but still worked extremely well. And people sort of were looking forward to the next one. In 1994, we get the next one. And this is, of course, the Hippopotamus, as mentioned in the diary entries from the memoir More For Me. In this book, once respected poet Ted Wallace, who has recently been fired as a theatre critic, is recruited by a goddaughter that he barely knew to investigate her cousin and Ted Wallace's other godchild to see if something is strange happening where this boy, David Logan, lives, a place called Swafford Hall in Norfolk. Swafford Hall is the base of Lord Michael Logan. Michael Logan is an old National Service buddy of Ted Wallace, and their relationship has only just recovered after various incidents where Ted Wallace has blotted his copybook and possibly stolen money from Michael Logan, and yes, generally been not a particularly good person. Ted Wallace is rather addicted to what he refers to as the electric soup. This is whiskey and usually Macallan. The mystery at Swafford Hall that involves David Logan, Ted Wallace's godchild, has something of a miracle aspect to it. His goddaughter Jane had been suffering from cancer and now seems to be in remission. One of David Logan's infant twin brothers might have recovered from a severe asthma attack due to David Logan's attentions. All of this is set fair to a kind of comic country house mystery with a potential for a little bit of miracle working inside. Of course, Ted Wallace is something of a cynic, and miraculous things, they don't quite gel with him. The Hippopotamus is my favourite of Stephen Fry's novels. It is full of lines that I would like to be able to quote, but they are pretty much, yes, unquotable in polite society. It is also rather notorious for a particular scene which involves a female horse, a mare, a footstool, a jar of Vaseline, and a priapic 15-year-old boy. And it is perhaps that scene which sort of rather overbalances the novel and makes it not quite respectable in a lot of people's eyes. I mean, because you always talk about that scene and you don't really concentrate on the rest of the novel, which I think is, as I said, great fun. There is a way in which the novel had a slightly odd afterlife. In 2011, Stephen Fry gives an interview to the Independent newspaper in which he talks about the way that men find sexual attraction much more easy than women, that men have a much higher sex drive than women, and this is all down to biology, of course. And this is one of the times we had to leave Twitter for about a month, as he did quite a lot throughout the 2010s. But when I read about this interview and read some of the interview, I recognised the text. It is a sort of internal diatribe that Ted Wallace, as narrator of The Hippopotamus, delivers, all about the differences in sexual attraction and sexual voraciousness in men and women. He uses the example of homosexual men, whilst acknowledging that they get a very bad time from the police, the public, and of course AIDS. For me, he does have a rather wonderful way of describing their sexual desire. It goes something along the lines of, "Man bent sees other man also bent, and sex is done." Indicating sort of the ease to which you might go from seeing somebody across a crowded room to indulging in a sex act in a matter of minutes or even a matter of seconds. Now, Ted Wallace attributes it all to basic biology. Now, that's kind of okay from a 60-year-old curmudgeon who sees women mostly as sexual objects, but it's not really the sort of thing you want to hear from a 50s-ish homosexual man in the 2010s, especially a real one rather than a fictional one. Stephen Fry holds on to these ideas without acknowledging that there's an awful lot of sort of gender and sex expectations placed upon women which controls their behaviour. He simply puts it all down to biology, which I don't think people were willing to hear at the time. The next two of Stephen Fry's novels are perhaps the novels he hoped would be in some ways his masterpieces. He was very proud of the setup for his 1997 novel Making History. In this novel, somebody finds a way of going back in time and prevents Hitler from being born. And we have to deal with the consequences of that, which is essentially somebody, well, not necessarily worse than Hitler, but actually more effective than Hitler. The book starts with some rather fanciful historical fiction about the birth of Adolf Hitler. And we learn fairly quickly that this has been written by a PhD candidate called Michael Young. He is studying at Cambridge, and his PhD is supposed to be in history, not in historical fiction. This means that his manuscript that he has spent an awful lot of time on, an awful lot of research upon, is virtually useless to his PhD advisor. After the particularly disastrous interview with his PhD advisor, he comes out of the college and bumps into Leo Zuckerman. Leo Zuckerman is a physicist working in Cambridge and also a concentration camp survivor. After dusting himself down and returning home to sort of clean himself up, Michael Young realizes that he has lost a large part of his PhD thesis, which he was planning to rewrite in some way to make it less of a sort of romantic historical fiction. His general failure as a PhD candidate does not help with his relationship with his girlfriend, and they break up. His ex-girlfriend or ex-fiancée is a biochemist working on fertility, particularly finding a way of making what was known as a male pill. Michael Young traces part of his missing thesis back to Leo Zuckerman. Leo Zuckerman is rather excited by Michael Young's research, because while it reads like historical fiction, it does have an awful lot of accurate detail and well-researched detail about Adolf Hitler's parents. Leo Zuckerman has built a time machine, something that it can inject objects back into the past, maybe something that will stop Hitler from ever being born. And Michael Young helps him with this. Michael Young then wakes up in Cambridge, but now it is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Instead of Adolf Hitler leading the Nazi Party and generally making everybody in the world upset, we get another Nazi Party leader. His name's Gloder, and he is a little bit more sensible. When he looks at the Jews, he sees their scientific and artistic merit, although he still wants to get rid of them. And how does he get rid of them? Well, he hears tell of the well water from a particular well in Austria, near the German border, for a short time had a property of rendering men infertile. Now, if they can reverse engineer that, possibly using Jewish scientists, perhaps they can feed it to an undesirable sections of the population so that they can no longer breed and will eventually disappear from the world. And this is what Glöder does. Slowly the Jews are being removed from the world, but there are no concentration camps or gas chambers to disgust everybody. Michael Young discovers that there is a Leo Zuckerman in his version of Cambridge. And that Leo Zuckerman has a lot of guilt because his father is the person who worked on reverse engineering the water samples from that well. I'm going to give away a scene in the book which I quite enjoy, but it will be a bit of a spoiler because it tells you a lot about how Glöder replaces Hitler. We have a scene which is slightly reminiscent of Cyrano de Bergerac, where de Guiche's command sash has been lost in no man's land, and Cyrano de Bergerac rescues it. This time it's not a command sash, it is a general's pickelhaube with a lobster tail. This pickelhaube with the lobster tail has been lost in no man's land, and people are discussing whether or not they should try to get it back. In the first run of the scene, Addy, a regimental runner, talking to his mates, also involves a certain Captain Glöder. He cheeks Captain Glöder and tempts Captain Glöder into going getting the pickelhaube. Captain Glöder would much rather somebody else goes about it and would be prepared to perhaps persuade somebody else to go and get it. But Addy is rather persuasive. Addy manages to get under his skin and sort of makes it a challenge for him, and it's a challenge that he doesn't feel that he can ignore. He heads out to get the pickelhaube, but is mortally wounded. The second time this scene is played out, according to Glöder's diary, there is no Addy to persuade him. Instead, Glöder persuades one of the troops knocking around to try it for themselves, and they suffer the same result. But Glöder survives. He survives to make speeches and to become the Führer. This is one of those science fiction tales which is very convincing while you were reading it, but on sort of reflection later you realise that things don't really work. Lots of people poured scorn on Stephen Fry's attempts at a time travel narrative and pointed out plenty of difficulties of why Glöder's final solution wouldn't have worked. Overall, I enjoyed this book, but it did point out a problem that I kind of had with The Liar and I was going to have with his next book. And that is that I really didn't get on with the protagonist. This is the Stephen Fry surrogate, Michael Young. He's not particularly likeable, he's clumsy, he really doesn't know how to have a relationship, and in some ways he's very stupid. He knows his subject extremely well, but outside that subject, yeah, he doesn't seem to be able to cope with life. And now unattractive characters can be interesting and you can want to follow their lives, but this particularly unattractive character is also not particularly interesting. I got the feeling that the author really didn't like this character, which was of course odd because the author is Stephen Fry and the character is a Stephen Fry surrogate. It is a bit of a problem with this book and to a certain extent with The Liar, although because of the autobiographical content and also the presence of Donald Trefusis, you don't notice it quite so much. There is quite an interesting, well at least for me, tale about the creation of Stephen Fry's fourth book, published in the year 2000. This book, The Stars Tennis Balls, or if you're in the United States where they don't believe in the Duchess of Malfi, Revenge, is essentially a retelling of The Count of Monte Cristo, a modern retelling, and actually in its early parts really quite well done. But the story behind it goes something like this. Stephen Fry has a bit of a brainwave one night, writes out an outline for his new novel, something that he hopes will correct all the problems of making history and will put him back on track. He's very pleased with this outline. He shows it to a friend who says, "Yes, Stephen, you know how your favourite novel is A Count of Monte Cristo? Yeah, this outline is The Count of Monte Cristo." This basic story was kind of retold at the time as if Stephen Fry was halfway through the novel when he was realised that he was writing and updating of The Count of Monte Cristo. Of course, any close analysis of the novel, it is completely untrue. It is very much planned from the start, and as I said, very well planned from the start. The setting updates the characters extremely well. For his characters' names, Stephen Fry uses a combination of puns and anagrams. So Edmond Dantes becomes Ned Madstone, and Mercedes becomes Portia. Now, I read The Count of Monte Cristo sometime last year, and really loved that book. I perhaps made the mistake of rereading The Stars Tennis Balls, because, yeah, although, as I said, the setup is very good on the characters, yeah, it pales in comparison with Alexander Dumas' work. It doesn't really stand up very well, especially in the final part of the novel, where the revenge that Ned Madstone takes on his tormentors, the people who got him locked up in a medical facility for many years, that revenge is rather brief and rather unsatisfying. Sort of half the Count of Monte Cristo is about the revenge and whether that revenge should be taken. And Stephen Fry gives us that revenge. He gives us a consideration of whether that revenge should be taken. Yes, but it feels, unfortunately, it feels rather as if he sketched it in, rather than developing it and kind of luxuriating it in the way that Dumas does. It's a rather strange thing to say that a book of 400 pages could possibly do with an extra 100 pages so that the revenge could really play out in a satisfying manner. But yeah, I did kind of feel that. It just feels a little bit rushed, a little bit perfunctory, diagrammatic. He's sort of decided what revenge needs to take place, and he basically tells you the revenge that needs to be takes place. But perhaps we need a little bit more of the show. And once again, I get this kind of idea that in looking at both his novels and his memoirs, he kind of loses interest after a while. Perhaps he started out The Stars Tennis Balls with a great deal of enthusiasm for this sort of recreation of Count of Monte Cristo, but by the time he gets to the end, he's kind of lost heart and he doesn't finish. And in the same way with the memoirs, the first one is a massive success, the second one they don't like, and then the third one he tries to course correct, but yeah, in the end it's diary entries, and it's a bit odd that he just keeps giving up, and it's a bit worrying as well. Another thing to say about The Stars Tennis Balls, and the thing I particularly didn't like, is there is a letter at the beginning. It is a letter written by a teenage girl, and it is a love letter to Ned Madstone. And it's ghastly. Well, I find it ghastly. I rather hope that Stephen Fry is very wrong about teenage girls' love letters. If I received such a thing, and never did, never would, I really would not have found it attractive. It's sort of gushy, and it just doesn't make me like the character of Portia. Ned Madstone, for me, suffers from the thing that I think I've identified, that Stephen Fry doesn't like Stephen Fry surrogates in his novels, and he's not the kind of character you want to read about anymore. It's a great pity. And in many ways, it's a great pity that Stephen Fry stopped writing novels. I mean, okay, we can speculate about why he gave up, but it is, I think, a great pity that he did. Yes, he had a number of knockbacks on his last two novels, but he could have picked himself up, dusted himself down and progressed. But Stephen Fry appears to be the kind of person who sort of, in times of stress, runs off to Bruges or considers his own mortality. There's no question that Stephen Fry is extremely able to write a good story. But looking at the novels, it does give me some doubt about whether or not he can do more than an embellished retelling. Left to his own devices, it doesn't quite work. And even in his retelling of his own life, even that didn't quite work. Perhaps he didn't quite want to be quite as confessional as he had been. Maybe he wanted to keep his own secrets. And that's fair enough. But for those of us who like Stephen Fry, you are always a little bit too curious about what he's like and what he feels and what he thinks. I would heartily recommend all of these novels. You really ought to read them. It will give you a great understanding of Stephen Fry, as will reading Paperweight and the 3 volumes of Memoir. And perhaps even reading his book on his ties might help you understand him. Perhaps you need to broaden your horizons beyond his recent Greek retellings, which have sold extremely well. Perhaps having done the Odyssey, he will move on to other retellings and will probably do them rather well. But at the end of the day, I'm more interested in Stephen Fry being creative than Stephen Fry retelling a story. Goodbye.